Aki and Nara were a recently married couple. To live a more comfortable life, the two decided to purchase an apartment in the suburbs. Both of them were overjoyed because they had discovered a location that was both inexpensive and convenient for travel. Sweet happiness didn't last long, as both of them were subjected to a terrifying story. It happened just a few weeks after the two moved into this apartment. There was an apartment in front of their house that was said to be empty, but Nara had seen a woman standing in front of the apartment door several times. When Nara noticed it, the woman turned to face the door, mumbling something inaudible. Although Nara was concerned about this issue, because Aki was preoccupied with the game, he only said a few words of comfort to calm her down. "There's nothing where there are no strange neighbors." Thinking everything would pass, Aki unexpectedly met the woman after his overtime work and returned home late. As soon as he stepped out of the elevator, Aki noticed a woman standing in front of the door to the apartment opposite his. The woman stood motionless, her head against the door frame, muttering something that piqued Aki's interest. Her behavior was identical to what Nara had described earlier. He also purposefully moved closer to hear her words clearly. It turned out that the woman wanted to enter the house but was unable to do so. Aki wondered if it was because she hadn't brought her keys, so he asked her if there was anyone else inside so he could assist her in calling and asking them to open the door. When she heard that, the woman turned her head and looked at Aki, her face expressionless, and explained that she was the only one living here and that there was no key to open the door. With no other option, Aki offered to call a locksmith to assist in opening the door. Following that, he immediately dialed the repair center, explained the situation to them, then hung up and went home, leaving the woman outside to wait. After about half an hour of resting in his house, he heard a knock on the door outside. The locksmith asked who needed assistance unlocking the door as soon as he saw Aki. Aki also quickly led the man over to the opposite apartment to meet the woman, but she was nowhere to be found. The locksmith assumed she had already found the key and entered the room. So the locksmith sighed and walked away. What a waste of time, despite Aki's apology, and offered to reimburse his travel expenses, which he declined. Things began to become more terrifying and terrifying as the days passed. When Nara and Aki were fast asleep in the middle of the night, they both heard a voice outside the door. Due to the quiet of the night, a loud cry woke both of them up, especially the cry that sounded like a lament, which was very sad. Because it was unusual for someone to call the door in the middle of the night, Nara did not dare to go see what was going on, so she let Aki open the door himself. On his face, Aki appeared unconcerned, but he was irritated at being bothered in this manner. He rolled out of bed, grabbed a baseball bat, and walked slowly to the door. The closer he got, the clearer the cry became. When Aki arrived at the door, he didn't rush to open it, but instead looked outside through the binoculars on the door to see who it was. At first glance, it appeared to be the same woman he had seen the last time. This time, however, she turned to find his family. Even more horrifying, Aki could see the corners of her eyes and her mouth bleeding and a distressed expression. She seemed to be aware that Aki was looking through the binoculars on the door, so she sobbed even more and begged him to help her. When Aki saw the scene, he became so nervous and scared that he suffocated and backed away from the door. Fortunately, the woman did not move. Aki quickly dashed back to his bedroom. Nara asked who was outside the door after noticing Aki's pale face and knowing there was something scary outside. To avoid frightening his wife, Aki pretended to be calm, claiming that it was just the cat meowing. Nara felt much better after hearing her husband say that. There were no more cries outside. Nara went to bed right away after solving the problem, but her husband couldn't sleep. He sat with his back to the head of the bed, his mind racing over what had just occurred. Aki requested a day off from work on Monday because he was sick. When his wife left for work, he went straight to the apartment building's management office to inquire about it. As soon as Aki walked into the office, he yelled at the manager, "You scammed us! This apartment has ghosts! That's why it's so cheap, isn't it?" The manager didn't understand what Aki said, and he was perplexed by what Aki said about ghosts. Aki immediately informed the manager of everything that had occurred over the last few days. The manager appeared suspicious, but he maintained a serious expression and listened intently to what Aki had to say. The manager quickly took out a small notebook with dense notes, as well as a large number of contact information for people who used to live here. He checked carefully and immediately found a phone number of Taro, the former owner who used to live in the apartment across the hall from Aki. They hadn't seen him in the apartment in 2 months. The manager paused for a moment, recalling that the last time he saw a woman accompanying him into that apartment was 2 months ago. Linking the facts, Aki suspected that there was a problem with that apartment, so he devised a plan to visit it to ascertain the situation. The manager, on the other hand, disagreed with Aki because it was someone else's house. Aki did not have the right to enter on his own. The manager considered that even if the apartment had problems, the management wasn't responsible for them. Aki was disappointed and concerned as he walked out of the management office. As he sat at home, he began to consider a few things. He and his wife had used up all of their savings to buy this house, and they still owed a significant amount of money to the bank. So they couldn't just walk away because they were haunted. The more he thought about it, the more enraged he became, and he didn't want his life to be ruined as a result of these things. He also couldn't afford to waste time waiting for someone else to solve the problem. He noticed the crowbar in the corner of the wall as soon as he looked to the side. When he looked at it, he had an idea. He stood up and looked towards the crowbar. To find the truth, he did not hesitate to make amends for the damage of that apartment. Thinking about it, Aki grabbed the crowbar and proceeded to the apartment across the hall. Aki inserted one end of the crowbar into the door and then tried his hardest to pry it open. An impact force deformed the door lock after hearing a few clicks. Finally, it was opened. Aki kicked open the door to gain courage. The door swung open quickly and collided with the wall, causing the door frame to be shaken. At that moment, an object fell from the door frame and landed hard on the ground. Aki quickly picked it up and discovered it to be a bronze mirror. This item was used to expel demons, and it was frequently hung in front of a house. He returned his gaze to the room. The surroundings were dusty and the air was gloomy and ghostly. At this point, Aki noticed a faint odor, not too rotten but strong enough to guess it was the stench of corpses. When he discovered suspicious traces, he abruptly came to a halt in front of a wall. The wall was streaked with light red water that emitted a stench. Water stains appeared to be leaking from within this wall. Aki was terrified when he realized what was behind the wall, but he had no choice but to dig into it in order to get an answer. Aki used all of his strength to hit the wall with the crowbar, and each piece of cement quickly broke down. The peculiarity was the concrete layer was not hard or thick but rather a thin layer. After the outer layer was removed, a layer of granular black material appears. Aki quickly reached out to brush away the layer of black grains. Then he touched something very soft and sticky. Aki began to tremble in fear after touching something filthy, and his forehead was also covered in beads of sweat. He didn't dare to wipe with his hand anymore, so he took a crowbar and continued chiseling the lime on the wall to see clearly. After the layers of material fell away, a purple-blue hand appeared on the wall, showing signs of decay and looking extremely frightening. Because he was terrified, Aki immediately backed away, his entire body trembling violently. Finally, he had to try to hold back his vomiting and flee this apartment. The police arrived less than half an hour after Aki called them and sealed off the entire scene. They also discovered the body of a woman who had been dead for more than 2 months in the wall. After the police began their investigation, they were able to identify the perpetrator, who also happened to be the owner of the apartment, Mr. Taro. The deceased woman was his lover. According to the testimony, Mr. Taro inadvertently killed the woman with a knife due to a personal conflict. He attempted to conceal his crime by concealing her body in the wall. To keep the stench at bay while hiding the body, he applied a layer of activated bamboo charcoal to the surface. As a result, when Aki punched the wall, the black granular soft substance that appeared was activated carbon. Aki later thought of it, perhaps because he was afraid of the witch's vengeance, so he attached a bronze mirror to prevent the woman from entering his house. Immediately after Mr. Taro's crimes were exposed, Nara and Aki no longer saw the woman's ghost. However, the apartment opposite their house was still sealed off and silent, sometimes causing them to live in fear. Dr. Chan was well known in the area for his healing skills and knowledge of all diseases. One day, he received a very serious invitation from a farmer's house in the village. Following the tour guide, he walked for more than 20 minutes to reach the place. According to the guide, his father seemed to be in a critical condition.
"Hurry up, doctor. My father can't take it anymore."
Arriving in front of the house, the man opened the old gate and invited Dr. Chan inside. As he led the doctor inside, he hurriedly called out to his mother.
"Mother, I invited Dr. Chan to come here."
The mother had just come out, repeatedly urging him in because she was afraid that her husband's condition would not make him last long. The mother invited Dr. Chan inside while talking about her husband's situation. Her husband just got sick 2 days ago and was getting worse very quickly. The person lying on the bed was an older man with a pale face and wide open mouth and eyes rolled backwards. Dr. Chan approached to examine the man's situation. The older man rolled his eyes, panicking and continuously shouting,
"It hurts so much. They are crawling all over me. Please kill me. I'm in so much pain."
A blanket covered the older man, so Dr. Chan didn't know what the man's problem was. So Dr. Chan decided to come and see what was under the blanket. But when he approached, the man strongly reacted to Dr. Chan. He pushed Dr. Chan away. It seemed that the disease had made the man panic and no longer aware of his surroundings. But with his years of experience, Dr. Chan quickly convinced the man to be examined. Despite following the doctor's orders, the older man still seemed to be very uncomfortable and afraid. As soon as he lifted the blanket, Dr. Chan was amazed to see the patient's current condition. The older man's belly was monstrously bulged. Suddenly, the older man appeared to be in pain, as if just moving could make his whole body suffer. Dr. Chan now seemed to understand the older man's condition, so he told the older man's son and wife to hold him tightly. Both of them joined forces to be able to hold the older man down, even though he was struggling with pain. After the older man was held tightly, Dr. Chan unbuttoned the older man's shirt, revealing a tight, swollen abdomen full of veins and blood. Dr. Chan now looked thoughtfully at the large and protruding belly of what looked like tendons. They were all very large and swollen on the skin of the older man's abdomen. But strangely, these tendons could move, or rather, it looked like worms or parasites inside of him. Dr. Chan seemed to have understood the problem. He turned to take out the acupuncture needles from the toolbox. The needles were long and sharp, but Dr. Chan believed that they could definitely help the older man now. Dr. Chan just stopped thinking for a moment, then started his treatment. Acupuncture needles were inserted into the older man's belly in sequence. Dr. Chan was very good at this acupuncture method. After a while, acupuncture needles were quickly inserted all over the man's belly, and the things that looked like worms also started to stop moving. And a few minutes later, they disappeared completely. No longer visible on the skin of the older man's belly, the older man now also began to calm down, feeling less pain, and was able to rest for a while. The son seemed very worried about his father. He hurriedly asked Dr. Chan what strange illness his father was suffering from. Dr. Chan did not talk directly about the disease at this time, but he began to learn more about the time the older man got sick. Dr. Chan said to the son,
"Your father had been infected with a type of poisonous parasite. If left for any longer, it would consume all of his organs. The situation is very dire."
The son asked Dr. Chan if his father would be saved. The wife also said that her husband suddenly became strange a few days ago after cutting grass to feed the cows. That's when he began to feel sick. Upon hearing that, Dr. Chan quickly asked her about the location of the lawn, as he wanted the patient's family to lead him there to check it out and inspect. According to his mother's description, the son also knew the location of the lawn area. By the time it was getting dark, the son had already started taking Dr. Chan because it was around wild grass growing relatively far from their home. On the way, the son still didn't understand why his father's illness had something to do with the wild grass. But Dr. Chan still didn't explain anything. He had his own conclusions. After walking quite a distance, the son said they were almost there. They just have to go behind the cliff and they would arrive. When he arrived, Dr. Chan was amazed and also afraid. It seemed that his suspicions were correct. In front of them was a bunch of weeds, as tall as people and at first glance, as normal as any other type of weed. Dr. Chan and the son started to walk closer to the grassy area. The doctor was extremely wary, but the son didn't know what was going on. Dr. Chan walked and looked around like he was looking for something. Finally, he found what he was looking for. Seeing that they had been gone for quite a long time from home, and with the doctor being extremely quiet without telling him about his father's condition, the son began to worry. At this point, Dr. Chan began to explain to the son the cause of the appearance of the parasites. A parasite caused his father's illness. They were infecting and sucking blood from his father's belly fat. The parasite was born from a strange worm, and it only reproduced on this type of weed. After that, Dr. Chan started rummaging through his tool bag. The son still didn't understand what Dr. Chan was going to do. Then Dr. Chan gave the son a thick scarf that looked like it was sewn with many layers. The two began to approach the weeds, and Dr. Chan needed to experiment a bit to be sure to find something that could treat the patient. After a while of searching, Dr. Chan reached out and picked a branch of the tree which grew among the weeds. Indeed, if they looked at it with the naked eye, it would be difficult to distinguish this plant in the middle of a vast lawn. Even the son was very surprised. Dr. Chan held up the branch high and asked the son to look closely above the small leaves, which were the eggs of the parasites. At this point, the son was starting to get scared but still wanted to know what it was, so he also looked at the leaf. And indeed, on the surface of the leaves, there were some seeds, tiny as white as a grain of rice. When he tried to take a closer look, the son suddenly realized that they were eggs and covered with thin membrane-like spider silk. The son wondered, this thing was so small, how could it cause such a terrible disease? Dr. Chan didn't explain much. He just asked the son to take a good look at what he does next. Dr. Chan rummaged through his pocket and pulled out a small vial. Then he gave it to the son, telling him to apply it on his face and hands. Applying this drug would help avoid insects, even those parasitic larvae that attack the body. After that, Dr. Chan started going deep into the grass, like he was looking for something. The weeds around here were taller than a person's head, so there was a lot of potential for danger. In the end, it seemed that Dr. Chan had found something important that could help cure the older man's illness. After reaching out to pick a tree branch, Dr. Chan showed it to the son. There were many small purple fruits on the branch, which looked very strange. Dr. Chan held it out in front of the son and told him to look for more fruits like this. It grew from the same tree on which the poisonous parasites lay their eggs. Dr. Chan told him to look carefully and pick a lot to bring back to save his father. The two began to split up to find and pick the strange fruit which only reproduced on this plant, and only its fruit could kill those parasites. In just a moment, the two were able to pick a lot of fruit. After getting out of the weeds, Dr. Chan suddenly took a small knife and cut a small cut on his finger. The son was extremely surprised but still very quiet, watching Dr. Chan. Next, Dr. Chan began to drip his own blood from the cut. The drop of blood fell directly onto the leaf containing the small larva eggs. At this moment, the son was putting the leaf on the handkerchief and holding it in his hand. What happened next made him extremely scared. After the drop of blood permeated the egg sacs, they seemed to begin to move. From within the tiny eggs, strange creatures looking like small worms began to break the egg sac and came out. At first, they were just bigger than a thread, but after they sucked all the blood on the leaf, they suddenly became as big as chopsticks. They gradually got bigger and bigger. In an instant, they almost filled out the entire handkerchief the son was holding, making him shiver with fear. At that moment, Dr. Chan took the purple fruit he had just picked. He gently squeezed the fruit and it immediately oozed a purple liquid. After that, he directly dripped it onto a parasite. Miraculously, the purple juice from the wild fruit worked. The poisonous parasite began to writhe in pain and then withered and died. Seeing these things, the son also understood what the doctor wanted to say. Suddenly, Dr. Chan seemed to remember something. He glanced at these weeds and thought for a moment. But now, it was getting dark. They needed to go home with this pile of purple fruit quickly. The doctor did not forget to ask the son if anyone had known this lawn area, and Dr. Chan began to worry when he looked closely at the weeds behind him. He was worried that if he continued to leave this lawn and this dangerous plant here, more people would be harmed. So Dr. Chan asked more carefully if this land was owned by anyone or not. Because the older man's condition was critical, they didn't talk much but quickly went home to treat him. Arriving home, Dr. Chan gave the bunch of plants to the wife and told her to get a basin and squeeze all the juice of these purple fruits into it. After squeezing the juice, Dr. Chan began to pull out all the needles that had been inserted into the older man's belly in the first place. Within those purple fruits seemed to be a lot of liquid, so a full basin was squeezed out. Dr. Chan said to the wife, "Take this wet towel and wipe your husband all over his body." This method would cause pain to the parasites and was intended to force the parasites out of the patient. Following Dr. Chan's instructions, the wife quickly wiped it all over her husband and then they allowed a few minutes so that the purple juice could penetrate the skin. A few minutes later, when the time came, Dr. Chan held a small scalpel. He cut an extended cut on the patient's wrist. This would be the way for the parasites to escape. And yes, after the purple water had penetrated into the skin, the parasites began to ache and increasingly wiggle beneath the older man's skin. They were crawling around and seemed to be looking for a way to get out. The sight was terrifying. Witnessing what happened in front of their eyes, the wife was terrified, wondering if her husband could stand it. Seeing that Dr. Chan tried his best to comfort her, everything would be resolved soon. At this point, the parasites began to appear all over the older man's body. It turned out that they had proliferated a lot in his stomach and were now trying to crawl out. The parasites eventually discovered the cut on the older man's wrist, so they started making their way there. In an instant, they began to crawl out from the wound on the older man's wrist. The scene was gruesome. Long parasites like worms were jostling to escape the older man's body. At a glance, these parasites were fat and red. It seemed that they had sucked a lot of blood from the older man's body. And after only a few minutes, all the parasites came out from the mouth of the wound. Underneath the floor, Dr. Chan also left a basin of purple fruit juice, so they fell straight into it. The purple juice began to work, directly killing those fat parasites. They withered and decomposed utterly, leaving only a pungent stench like the smell of carrion. After the parasites had all escaped, the older man's body started returning to normal. Dr. Chan turned back and informed the son and his mother that his father was out of danger. Dr. Chan advised a few more things to take better care of the older man. After a few days of rest, he would get better. After that, Dr. Chan also said goodbye to the older man's family because he needed to handle something important. Because he already had a plan in mind, Dr. Chan decided to deal with this problem decisively. Otherwise, many more people would be harmed by this poisonous parasite. That night, Dr. Chan walked towards the weed area in the afternoon. He lit a fire and burned it all. He hoped that no one would be accidentally infected with this blood-sucking parasite ever again.
Hello. I'm a mother as well as a housewife like many other women. I have a son. His name is Yang. Fortunately, he is back to normal after a scary incident. That day, like any other day, Yang went to school and I stayed at home to cook. Even though many years had passed, everything reminds me of it. It was a very painful and sad memory. That year, I was just pregnant with Yang on the way home from the antenatal checkup. My husband and I accidentally had a severe traffic accident. My husband passed away. I was left alone, giving birth to my own child and raising him to be a responsible human. Even though my husband's death caused me great pain, seeing my healthy son being born gave me some comfort. As he got older, Yang began to act strange. Like the days we just moved into our new house, Yang kept looking into the distance. Then he would burst into tears like he just saw something unnerving. And every time that happened, there was no way to stop him from crying. Only when he would go out, he would eventually stop crying. Each time I was curious about what Yang saw because it was clear that he was just staring into an empty space in front of him. Sometimes he played alone happily. It would look like someone was playing with him, but nothing out of the ordinary was remarked. He seemed to be joking around and was very familiar with his imaginary friend. Seemed like he even had more fun than being with me. When Yang and I were playing jigsaw puzzles on the floor, Yang suddenly stopped and stared at the ceiling without saying anything. I wondered what he was looking at and asked Yang what did he saw on the ceiling. But he was incredibly focused. In return, the answer gave me chills. Someone was apparently hanging from the ceiling and seemed to want to play with him. But then again, I didn't see anything. I assumed that Yang had an imaginary friend, just like any other developing child. And that wasn't weird at all. But even when he was about to go to bed, he said that someone always lulled him to sleep every night. It became stranger by the day and made me question my sanity as I began to suspect that something strange was happening with my child. One day, when I took Yang for a walk, I met an old lady next door. The older woman looked at Yang and asked me strange questions. But the strange thing was that what she was asking was very similar to Yang's situation at that time, referring to him often talking to himself and repeatedly saying that he saw someone who was invisible to the naked eye. Suddenly, the older woman had a severe look on her face. She asked carefully about Yang's condition, whether he only saw them or was close to this invisible person. I saw the older woman's seriousness and wanted to find out about my son's situation. So I told the older woman the truth, that the boy seemed very close to that person. He even said that the invisible person sang him to sleep every night. Suddenly the older woman became alarmed. She said that if I didn't find a way to save Yang, the boy would lose his soul, get very sick, and die. She told me to call her if necessary, then gave me her phone number and left. But looking at my healthy son playing with a small dog in the distance, I doubted the older woman's words because I thought that children would always imagine invisible friends. Because children were growing up, and since Yang lost his father before he was born, he might have felt lonely. I still ignored what the older woman said until that afternoon. I took Yang to the park next to the forest to have dinner because I thought it would be good for him to go out more. But suddenly Yang went straight into the forest behind us. Even when I called his name, he didn't pay attention at all and would continue going deeper into the forest. Feeling strange, I quietly followed Yang because I wanted to know what was happening to my child. A little way to the edge of the forest, Yang stopped, turned to look at me, and then began to say incomprehensible things. He said that the people inside the forest were agitated and angry because the loggers had harmed their home. They said the loggers cut down all the trees around their residence, exposed them to wind, rain, and landslides that damaged their homes. I looked into the forest, but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I didn't understand what he was talking about either, so I comforted him and took him home. But I began to remember the older woman's words and felt doubtful about it all. I began to believe that the imaginary friend was not Yang's own creation. That night, after Yang went to bed, I couldn't sleep. So I grabbed my phone and scrolled through the recent news. Suddenly, a piece of news caught my eye that shocked and surprised me to the extreme. In the middle of the forest was a large cemetery. They had cut down all the trees and intended to dig up the old graves there to move to another place, and they would use that land to build high-rise buildings. And the graves had all collapsed because forest exploitation affected the environment. I suddenly remembered the words that Yang said that morning. I stood thoughtfully in front of my son's bed and started to get a little scared. If what the older woman said was true, would it be dangerous to my son? And the next day, I continued to take him out to relax. But that day he seemed very strange, not as active as usual. He suddenly became afraid of everything, always hiding behind me and saying that there were too many people around. Even looking out in the street, the boy appeared worried, because the people were crawling towards him and their faces were supposedly very scary. Finally, out of panic, Yang seemed very tired and had a cold sweat on his forehead, even though I couldn't see what he was saying at all. Seeing that Yang's condition was getting worse and worse, and he could barely raise his head to look around, I decided to take a taxi home. Sitting in the car, he got worse. His face turned purple, his sweat didn't stop dripping, and he looked so tired. Halfway there, Yang suddenly asked to get out of the car because next to where I was sitting, it seemed that someone was sitting and staring at him. According to him, that person was inviting him to go somewhere. I was extremely worried about my son, but I could only hug him or comfort him. I then called the taxi to stop so we could walk. Since this area was an area close to home, there were usually many people passing by, so I thought it would help Yang to be less afraid. But it only seemed to make things worse. The neighbor's dog was usually very fond of Yang. But that day, it also looked at my son and barked fiercely. My child seemed to be very afraid of the dog. The closer he got, the more the dog looked at Yang and barked like it could see something next to Yang. Seeing the dog act like that, I started to get even more worried, and I believed that what the older woman next door said to me might be right after all. As soon as the owner took the dog away, Yang was able to calm down and reduce his fear, while he usually would still play with the dog. When he got home, he started getting a fever. I tried everything but still couldn't help his fever. His face started to turn purple, the sweat didn't stop, and he was mumbling weird things. At this point, I was too worried and had no choice but to try and call the older woman next door because I understood that my boy was not suffering from some common illness. After listening to everything she told me, the older woman showed me how to help Yang recover, but I had to believe all of it and do as she told me. Not long after, someone brought me a chicken. I wondered what was going on. Then the girl said she was from the older woman's family, and the older woman told her to bring me a chicken. And according to the older woman's advice, I had to quickly cut off the chicken's head to get blood for my son before midnight tonight. Luckily, I found the older woman in time. This was the first time I had to take a knife to cut off a chicken's head, so I was nervous and didn't dare to do it. My hands were shaking so much that I couldn't hold the knife steady. But because of my child and my husband gone, I couldn't stand the thought of losing my child. So I mustered up courage. I closed my eyes and cut down hard on the chicken's neck. Its head was cut off and blood splattered everywhere. Blood splashed all over my face and eyes, but finally it was done. Then, as the older woman instructed me, I had to take a piece of a white towel, soak the chicken's blood with it, and cover Yang's eyes with it. Then I wrapped the white cloth around the boy's head. The boy suddenly felt much better. I was also happier, and as long as I left the cloth over his eyes after midnight, everything would be fine. So I encouraged him to keep going. After midnight, I removed the towel, and he seemed to be getting better. After some time, the boy returned to normal, and it seemed he could no longer see strange things or invisible people. But maybe because I got some chicken blood in my eyes that day, I also started seeing weird things. For example, when walking alone at night, I would always feel like someone was watching me from behind. And I also clearly saw some invisible people that Yang had seen before. I chose to ignore all of it, as if I didn't see anything, so my life would continue peacefully, next to my son and his. It was the terrifying story of the sudden and unexplained deaths of the guys in my group.
They were so well known that people believed my village was cursed. In the day, I had a date to drink with some friends, An, Yin, and Gao. After drinking until we could no longer see the sun, we split up and went home. Because An was the closest person to Yin's house, An took the initiative to bring Yin home. "You are too drunk. Let me take you home." Even though Yin was drunk, he refused An's kindness and asked to walk home alone. "I can't get drunk. You can rest assured. I'll go home. Goodbye, see you tomorrow." An was extremely worried about Yin, so he followed him quietly for a while until he saw Yin turn into a familiar alley. Yin walked into the residential area. He lived alone in a small 20 square meter room. He worked and supported himself. As soon as Yin got home, he sat down on the bed, took off his socks, sighed and rested. He had a bad habit of soaking his feet in hot water at night to relax his muscles and help him sleep better. So in the night, as usual, Yin soaked his feet in a large basin of water, comfortably enjoyed life, and went to bed. But we hadn't been able to contact Yin since the day, so all of them concerned went to Yin's house to check. An eagerly knocked on the door and called out Yin's name, but Yin did not respond. Because Yin lived alone here, An was worried and impatient. He didn't know if Yin had any problems in the room or not. An was standing thoughtfully when he felt water under his shoes. We immediately bent down to take a look and discovered that water was pouring out of Yin's room and spilling into the hallway. We all had a bad feeling in our hearts, so we broke the door and rushed in. When we entered, there was an unpleasant stench and the entire room was dark without a light. The gloom in Yin's room made us doubt his safety, so we all went straight to Yin's bedroom to check it out. We gently pushed Yin's bedroom door open and entered. Unexpectedly, we discovered a painful story. Yin had been lying motionless on the ground for a long time. His face was still in the basin of water. His body was already cold. An panicked and stood immovably on the spot. I and Gao hurriedly picked up Yin and checked his condition. Unfortunately, when we found Yin, he had died of suffocation. The second terrifying event occurred to Gao. Gao received notification that the item he had ordered from abroad had arrived, and he needed to go to town to pick it up. Gao hurriedly put on his coat and went outside, without realizing that the god of death was waiting for him. Gao's parents saw that it was dark and the road was dangerous, so they advised him to go tomorrow morning. However, Gao reassured everyone in the house by promising to return soon, and he was very confident in his steering. His wife stood at the door to see him off, always reminding him to be careful and return home early. Gao hummed to let it go and then hurried away. Looking at Gao's back, his wife was a little sad in her heart but didn't know how to describe it. Gao left the house, taking the familiar village road he used to take. He recalled his family's advice to drive slowly. It took a long time to get to town now, so Gao devised a plan to take a shortcut. The scene was dark now, and only the sound of Gao's car could be heard throughout the forest. Gao's car broke down while he was driving on the road, and the speed suddenly became faster, making it difficult for him to brake. Gao tried to control his car, but nothing could slow it down. The car was getting faster and faster, making Gao very nervous. Gao suddenly saw a sign in front of him. He realized that he was entering an area under construction. A forbidden sign appeared in front of him. Gao swerved to the side as a reflex to avoid the sign. Everything happened so quickly that Gao couldn't keep up with the pace and handle the situation in front of him. A loud noise rang out. Blood spurted out and Gao's head was severed in an instant by a rope. Gao and the car crashed to the ground, splashing on a nearby lawn. Gal's entire body was immobile on the ground. The road construction workers returned to work in the next morning. They were alarmed when they discovered the bulletin board and the rope had broken, leading them to believe that there had been an accident. The worker was horrified to discover Gal's body when he looked to the side of the bush. His body was covered in blood and turned into white. The scariest thing was that his head was severed. It looked so scary. A month later, when everything had calmed down, the next scary thing happened to Ann. In the day, myself and Ann went to the market to buy some things to visit the graves of our two friends. By chance, we came across a fortune-telling stall in the middle of the market. The fortune-teller invited us in to look at some of the lots, but Ann pulled away my hand because he was not a superstitious person. But the fortune-teller kept calling us, and his voice was so urgent that the two of us noticed and decided to go check it out. Ann coldly looked at the fortune-teller, wanting him to tell his story quickly so that he could go shopping elsewhere. He pointed at Ann and said, "You are haunted. You need to buy my charms to wear around your neck to exorcise evil spirits." Ann didn't hear him finish the foretelling and left angrily. He told me that the fortune-teller now only cheated and scared children, and he didn't want to hear anything else. The old fortune-teller still called Ann back, telling him to stay away from lakes, rivers, and streams if he wanted to live. "If you don't believe me, you will only die." Ann calmly smiled and stated that such things didn't exist in the world. Then he invited me to join him at the bar for a few drinks tonight. I didn't think much of it, nodded in agreement, and discussed with Ann about tonight's drinking party. The two of us quickly forgot the story which the fortune-teller told. In the evening, like the old time, I met Ann at a familiar bar where we used to drink. We drank together until late at night. Because both of us had a good drink, even though it was too late, we still didn't feel drunk. I saw Ann off for a while because our house was on the same road. Two of us passed a dike in the village, chatting happily as we were walking. When Ann reached the middle of the dike, he suddenly heard Yin and Gal's voices calling to him, causing him to turn around. But the surroundings remained dark and no one was present. I was surprised and asked Ann, "Hey, what is going on?" Ann immediately inquired as to whether or not I had heard anyone calling. I looked at Ann perplexedly. His face was now filled with panic expressions, and he was adamant that he had seen Gao and Yin. I immediately reassured Ann that it was possible that he was drunk and might have misheard something, so I took him home. When Ann got home, his face was pale. I was worried. After dropping Ann at his house, I then returned to mine with a peace of mind. A few days later, we heard that Ann had gone missing after drinking with me, so the whole village organized a search. Ann's family also informed the police, but nothing had changed. I too was heartbroken and terrified, recalling the fortune-teller's words to us and knowing that they had come true on Ann. At the same time, the village's sewer system unexpectedly broke down, preventing water from entering the field. People suspected that it had become blocked. As a result, when the blockage was discovered, the workers broke the water pipes and discovered a horrific scene. It was terrifying because there was a dead body in the sewer. The corpse was decomposed and gave off a strong smell, which was the reason why the sewer pipes were blocked. It was scary that the body was Ann's. It turned out that he slipped and fell into the sewer and got stuck there in the previous night. I was shocked when I realized that the fortune-teller's words had come true. A long time ago, in my village, a strange thing happened, originating from the reclaiming wasteland by the edge of the forest under the borders of the village chief to build an administrative office. The digging work went quite smoothly and without any problems. According to the plan, 1 week later the construction team must complete the work, so the work was in a very urgent situation. The voice of the supervisor urging and pressure from the village chief on the workers here made the atmosphere extremely tense. During construction, suddenly the group of workers accidentally saw a strange object lying deep in the ground. Looking from afar, it was no different from an antique chest. Seeing that, everyone discussed digging it up to see. But the more people dug, the more they suspected that it was a coffin. The construction team began to vigorously dig up the pile of dirt to see what strange buried things were underneath. After a while, workers unearthed a sizable wooden coffin that looked old, making everyone's faces pale with fear. After a while of digging, workers discovered not only one wooden coffin, but also 5 identical wooden coffins arranged against each other. By looking at it, everyone knew that these coffins were not normal, so they discussed calling the Feng Shui master to come check it out and give advice to the people in the village. After a while, the Feng Shui master also came. He was eccentric, but in return, he was a person with high spiritual ability, so everyone in the village respected him.
This area had a lot of yin kui. It looked like something bad was about to happen,
he said. As soon as he finished speaking, suddenly the ground shook slightly as if something had just escaped from there. While everyone was bewildered, the old Feng Shui master also approached them. Everyone in my village was worried, not knowing what the hell was going on, and kept asking the Feng Shui master. However, he just silently turned his glasses and looked ahead.
Oh my gosh, this was a scary curse.
He said that these 5 coffins were used to bury 5 people to protect the village's dragon veins, so digging it up would put the whole village in danger. The Feng Shui master immediately felt the seriousness of the incident and shouted,
"Quickly, stop the construction immediately!"
After thinking for a while, the Feng Shui master immediately told everyone to bring these 5 coffins back to their original position and bury them as they were at the beginning. Otherwise, every year, my village would have 5 people die. Everyone was worried, but they could not stop the construction. This was the order of the village head. While the workers were stirring and discussing, the village chief came and asked everyone what happened. The workers told everything to the village chief and then advised him to stop the construction work to put the 5 coffins back to their original positions. But he didn't seem to agree. He shouted loudly, telling the construction manager how stupid it was to listen to an older man's hoax. The village chief at that time thought that it was necessary to speed up the construction progress. Because they were frightened by the original words, everyone immediately went to persuade the village chief to bury the 5 coffins. But the village chief firmly disagreed because his superiors supervised this construction project, so it couldn't be delayed another day. Seeing that the village chief was angry, the workers immediately ignored the advice of the Feng Shui master and sent a car to deliver 5 coffins. The Feng Shui master saw this and quickly stopped. He rushed over, preventing everyone from carrying the 5 coffins away. But not only was it unsuccessful, but it also made the atmosphere noisy and uncomfortable. So the construction manager immediately ordered the workers to take the Feng Shui master elsewhere. But no matter what, he still refused to go. The older man watched the car carrying the coffins and was extremely scared. The older man shouted in fear, his mouth constantly repeating the sentence,
"Oh my God, this village would be in trouble! This village would be cursed!"
What the Feng Shui master said was immediately considered crazy. No one cared about him anymore. The next day, a man who was also a worker in the construction took advantage of his leave to go to the pond to catch fish like every other day. He tried electric fishing at the friend's advice in the group to catch fish faster and more, but for unknown reasons or carelessness, his electric box was short-circuited, causing him to be electrocuted, and he died on the spot. His body was later found at the edge of the pond 3 days later. A few days later, another worker in the village on his way to work accidentally passed the bend where 5 coffins were buried. Although running at a rather slow speed, for some reason when he was cornering, his car lost direction, causing him to fall to the ground. The fall caused him to hit his head hard on a large rock on the side of the road, traumatic brain injury, and death on the spot. Since then, another person, who had also been a construction worker, whose family was not peaceful, often quarreled with his wife. On a night of arguing, the couple was bored. He left his home to the garden alone to calm down. After waiting for a long time, the wife did not see her husband in the room, so she had a feeling that something was not good and went out to see. Unexpectedly, when she had just arrived, the husband had hanged himself. He also didn't leave the last word or any suicide note. There were 3 funerals in my village in just 1 week, causing the whole village to be covered with mourning and death. People in the village began to be curious about the 3 deaths of the workers and suddenly remembered the words that the Feng Shui master said the day before. Everyone knew that it was the curse of the 5 coffins applying on the village, so they felt extremely insecure. The 3 victims were all construction workers in our team. I thought that curse caused it. Another person said that currently 3 people had died, so there would be 2 more. If not resolved soon, it was very likely that the same thing would happen. So they decided to go to the village chief together to ask to bury the other 5 coffins back to the old place. People gathered in front of the village chief's house, very crowded, shouting and banging on the door loudly. The village chief heard the commotion and came out from inside the house. His face was both annoyed and angry, not knowing who made a mess at his door. As soon as they saw the village chief, the people in the village booed, blamed the deaths of the 3 people in the village on his cause, and demanded that he pay for their lives. But the village chief felt that this was nonsense and myth. He kicked them out and threatened that he would not pay them if they rebelled. The people in the village at that time felt disgruntled, but couldn't do anything else. On the way back, they talked gloomily, discussed, and pulled over to the Feng Shui master's house to ask him how to solve the curse. Everyone thought nothing of it, immediately rushed to the Feng Shui master's house to ask for advice. After knowing the matter, the Feng Shui master immediately reproached. His face was extremely indifferent, as if he did not care. Some people even came in front of him asking him about the identity of the next person who would die. The old man immediately washed his hands in innocence, not caring about it. His attitude was extremely frightened.
You people, go home, please. I don't know anything. Don't bother me.
So the villagers tried to convince him to give them advice, but it was no use. The older man shouted loudly, saying that it was difficult to stop the curse. It was too late. Many more people would die. The people in the village looked at each other helplessly. Could there be no other way? The atmosphere was quiet when the Feng Shui master suddenly said that there was still one solution, but there was a very high price to pay.
For the sake of the villagers, I would use this method. Everyone just needed to do what I say to break this curse,
he said. A few days later, the 4th worker lost his life while doing drugs. The fifth person to die was a worker who drove to bring 5 coffins. The sad thing here was that one day later, the Feng Shui master also died while sleeping. The villagers held a funeral for him. Everyone sympathized with his sacrifice. It turned out that the method of breaking the curse of the Feng Shui master was to use his own life in exchange for others. 5 coffins would be buried under the execution area where the prisoners were executed to ensure the Yin Kui had the most. And the 6th coffin buried with and on top of those 5 coffins was the coffin of the Feng Shui master.